John the Baptist beheaded. The halls of Herod's palace buzzed with murmurs of curiosity and unease. News of Jesus and his miraculous works had reached Herod's ears, shaking the tetrarch to his core. He sat upon his ornate throne, gripping the arms tightly, his mind wrestling with the whispers of the extraordinary. "This is John the Baptist," he muttered, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and guilt. "He has risen from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are at work in him." The very thought sent shivers down his spine. Herod's gaze drifted, and his mind retraced the events that had brought him to this moment. He had once ordered John the Baptist to be arrested, binding him and throwing him into the darkness of a prison. The reason? Herodias, the wife of his brother Philip. John had publicly denounced their unlawful union, boldly proclaiming, "It is not lawful for you to have her." The words had struck Herod like a dagger, exposing the shame he sought to ignore. Though Herod was angered by John's boldness, he was also afraid to harm him. The people revered John as a prophet, and Herod feared their wrath. Yet Herodias, seething with rage, saw John as a threat that needed to be eliminated. The fateful day came during Herod's grand birthday celebration. The palace was alive with music, laughter, and the clinking of goblets as guests indulged in lavish feasts. Amid the revelry, Herodias' daughter stepped forward to perform a dance. The room fell silent as she moved with grace and allure, captivating everyone in attendance. Herod, too, was mesmerized, his pride and pleasure evident on his face. When the dance ended, applause erupted, and Herod, overcome by the moment, made a grand promise. "Ask me for anything you wish," he declared, "and I will give it to you." He swore this oath before all his guests, his voice ringing with conviction. The young woman hesitated, her gaze shifting toward her mother. Herodias, with calculated precision, leaned close and whispered into her ear. A wicked gleam flickered in the girl's eyes as she turned back to Herod. "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist," she said, her voice steady, her request chilling. Herod froze, the weight of her words crashing over him like a tidal wave. He was grieved, deeply troubled by the demand. He respected John, and part of him recoiled at the thought of carrying out such a heinous act. Yet the oaths he had sworn, the eyes of his dinner guests watching his every move, these bound him. To refuse now would be to lose face, to show weakness. Reluctantly, Herod gave the order. Soldiers descended into the dark prison, and soon the act was carried out. John the Baptist, the fearless voice of truth, was silenced. His head was placed on a platter and brought to the girl, who, in turn, delivered it to her mother, Herodias. The moment was macabre, the grotesque culmination of Herodias' vengeful scheme. John's disciples, hearing of his death, came to retrieve his body. With heavy hearts, they buried him, mourning the loss of their teacher and friend. They then went to Jesus, their steps weighed down by sorrow, to report what had happened. In the quiet of that moment, the tragedy of John's death echoed not only through Herod's palace, but through the hearts of those who had followed him. Herod, though he had silenced John's voice, could not silence the truth it carried. And Jesus, the one of whom John had spoken, continued his mission, a light shining brighter even in the shadow of loss. 5,000 fed. The news of John's death struck Jesus deeply, the sorrow settling like a weight in his heart. Seeking a moment of solitude, he stepped into a boat and rowed across the shimmering water, leaving behind the crowds that always seemed to gather. The stillness of the sea mirrored his need for quiet, a brief escape to pray, to grieve, and to be alone with his Father. Yet, even in his retreat, the people followed him. Word spread quickly from city to city, and soon, crowds of men, women, and children were making their way on foot to meet him. They carried their sick and weary, drawn by the hope of his presence and the power of his touch. As the boat glided ashore, Jesus stepped onto the land and was met by a sight that stirred his heart. The vast crowd stretched out before him, their faces etched with need, their bodies marked by exhaustion. He could have turned them away, but instead, compassion welled up within him. Despite his own sorrow, he moved among them, healing their sick, restoring their hope, and meeting their needs with gentle care. The day wore on, and as evening approached, the disciples grew concerned. The place was remote, far from the nearest villages, and the sun was sinking low. They came to Jesus and said, "This place is desolate, and the hour is already late. Send the crowds away, that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus turned to them, his voice steady and filled with purpose. "They do not need to go away," he said. "You give them something to eat." The disciples looked at one another, their expressions a mix of confusion and disbelief. "We have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish," they replied, holding up their meager provisions. It was a boy's small meal, barely enough for the 12 of them, let alone the multitude before them. "Bring them here to me," Jesus said, his tone unwavering. He instructed the people to sit down on the grass, their murmurs of curiosity rippling through the crowd. As they settled, the disciples handed him the loaves and fish. Jesus took them, his hands gentle yet certain, and lifted his gaze toward heaven. He gave thanks to his Father, blessing the food, and then began breaking the loaves. Piece by piece, he handed the bread and fish to the disciples, who turned to distribute it among the people. At first, they hesitated, unsure how far such a small amount could go. But as they moved through the crowd, something miraculous unfolded. The food never ran out. Basket after basket was filled, and every hand that reached out for nourishment was met with plenty. The people ate, their hunger replaced by satisfaction. They marveled at the abundance, the impossible provision that fed them all. 5,000 men, along with women and children, sat together, sharing in this miraculous feast. When everyone had eaten their fill, the disciples gathered the leftover pieces, filling 12 baskets to the brim. The abundance was staggering, a reminder of God's limitless provision and care. As the evening settled into twilight, the crowd lingered, their hearts full not just from the meal, but from the presence of the one who had fed them. For some, the miracle was a revelation, a glimpse of the kingdom breaking into their world. For others, it was a mystery, something they would carry with them as they returned to their homes. For Jesus, it was a moment of compassion that transcended his own grief, a tangible expression of the love and power of the kingdom of heaven. And for the disciples, it was a lesson in trust and faith, a reminder that even the smallest offerings, placed in his hands, could become a blessing beyond measure. The quiet sea and the star-strewn sky bore witness to the miracle, their beauty reflecting the glory of what had unfolded on that remote shore. Jesus walks on the water. As the last light of day faded and the crowds finally dispersed, Jesus stood alone by the sea, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The disciples had already departed in the boat, heading to the other side, as he had instructed. The stillness of the evening wrapped around him like a cloak, and he turned toward the mountains, seeking solitude to pray. The weight of the day's events, teaching, healing, and feeding thousands, pressed heavily on his heart, but in the quiet, he found strength in communion with his Father. Meanwhile, the disciples were far from land, their small boat caught in the grip of a fierce and contrary wind. The waves rose high and crashed against the sides, battering the vessel and tossing it mercilessly. The men, seasoned fishermen though they were, gripped the edges of the boat, their faces pale with exertion and fear. The hours crept by, and the storm showed no sign of relenting. It was the 4th watch of the night, the darkest hours before dawn, when something extraordinary occurred. Through the whipping wind and stinging spray of the sea, a figure appeared, walking toward them on the water as though it were solid ground. The disciples, their nerves already frayed, froze in terror. "It is a ghost!" someone cried, their voices rising in panic. But then the figure spoke, a voice they knew well, calm and steady even amidst the chaos. "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." The words cut through the storm like a beacon, steadying their hearts. It was Jesus. Peter, ever bold and impetuous, called out, his voice tinged with both awe and hesitation. "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus, his tone inviting, replied with a single word, "Come!" Peter climbed over the edge of the boat, his heart pounding as his feet touched the surface. To his astonishment, the water held him, and he began to walk toward Jesus, each step fueled by faith. The wind whipped around him, the waves lapping at his legs, but his eyes remained fixed on the one before him. Then, as he felt the strength of the wind and the fury of the sea, doubt crept in. His focus wavered, his faith faltered, and in that instant, he began to sink. Panic seized him as the water rose around him, and he cried out desperately, "Lord, save me!" Immediately, Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him, pulling him up from the depths. "You of little faith," he said gently, his eyes meeting Peter's. "Why did you doubt?" Though the words carried a rebuke, they were also filled with compassion. Together, they climbed into the boat, and as soon as Jesus stepped inside, the wind ceased. The sea calmed, its surface smoothing into a glassy stillness. The disciples, who had watched the scene unfold in awe, fell to their knees. Their voices trembled with reverence as they said, "You are certainly God's Son." When dawn finally broke, they reached the shore at Gennesaret. News of Jesus' arrival spread like wildfire through the surrounding districts. People streamed to him from every direction, bringing their sick and ailing loved ones in the hope of healing. They begged just to touch the fringe of his cloak, believing that even the smallest contact with him could restore them. And their faith was not in vain, for as many as touched it were cured, their bodies renewed, and their hearts filled with gratitude. The storm and the stillness, the sinking and the saving, the doubt and the faith, all of it bore witness to the glory of the one who walked upon the waves and healed the broken. In him, the disciples and the crowd saw not just a teacher, but the Son of God, whose power and compassion knew no bounds.